Welcome to everyone to the March Sol Speaker Series. And I'm Fleet Captain Barb Barton, and I'm the Director of Sciences. And you've got me twice this year already. I did a talk a couple months ago. Luckily for you, or not, I do a lot of presentations. So if we need to fill in quickly, I'm able to do that, which is great. So we can keep the event going. All right. Well, thank you for sticking around to hear my talk on Manoomin, the story of wild rice in Michigan. So for those of you who don't know where Michigan is here in the United States, we're kind of in the north central, a little bit to the east part of the country, and we're known as the Great Lakes state because of all of the freshwater lakes around us that are really like seas rather than just a lake. This talk I'm going to do covers the entire state, and you can see we have an island up here. This is Isle Royal National Park. That is part of Michigan. Too bad for Minnesota. They lost that in the deal. So what is wild rice? Wild rice is an aquatic grass that grows in the wild. It grows in lakes and rivers here, and its range across the United States is primarily the eastern half of the country. There is an endangered species of wild rice in Texas, a very, very small population there. Most people think of wild rice in the Great Lakes region in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and in Canada. It has a very interesting life history. In the upper right-hand corner of this picture, you can see these long leaves floating on top of the water. This is what's called the floating leaf stage. And in the springtime, when the ice breaks off and the sunlight's able to come down and warm the bottom of the lake or river, the plant will start to grow up and form these very long, thin leaves. It's very susceptible to being dislodged at this time. So if you think about spring flooding, where you get high water events coming from water rushing down the river, a lot of wave action, or people driving boats in this area, it can dislodge these plants. And you can see this one here has been dislodged. The roots are showing. That's a very vulnerable time for that plant. That's in the early springtime. Usually around June, the plants will start to flower. And then in August into September and sometimes into early October, the plants will produce the seeds, which is where the wild rice that people eat comes from. And here's a picture of the seeds. You can see it looks similar to some of the grasses you might see out in a meadow or out in a wetland area. This picture in the lower right is actually a photograph of river rice. And the river rice seeds, as you can see here in this photo, have a very long, what we call a tail or an awn. When the seed drops down into the water, it's quite fascinating to watch. They spin around, and it's like a corkscrew, and they embed themselves down into the sediment, so they're protected. We have two types of rice in the Great Lakes region. We have lake rice, which you can see in the upper left. That is about 4 feet tall, sometimes 5 feet tall from the surface of the water. And then the river rice, which I just talked about. The river rice grows specifically on the edges of the rivers, and they can get up to 12, 13 feet tall. This plant is in Michigan listed as a state threatened species because of its rarity. And here's another shot of it. It looks quite different than the lake rice. It has wider leaves, much taller, thicker stem, and very long flower heads and grain seed heads with that long on I was talking about before. So what's the importance of wild rice? So wild rice is uh, like superfood for waterfowl. We have a lot of migrating waterfowl that come through in the fall by the tens of thousands, and wild rice is an important food for them to make their trips down south. It improves water quality. It provides a lot of cover for nesting birds. There's also a couple fish species here in Michigan that the fish biologists believe only nest in wild rice beds, which is pretty interesting. And there's also a lot of other threatened and endangered species that can occur in these types of habitats where the wild rice is growing. The wild rice is very, very important to the tribal people of this region, the Anishinaabek. And the Anishinaabek are composed of basically three tribes, three tribal groups, I should say, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. In Michigan, we have 12 federally recognized tribes. They belong to one of those three groups. And their traditional teachings were that long time ago, they all lived up in this northeastern part of the United States and southeastern Canada here, what is now called that. And they were visited by prophets and given prophecies. Two of the prophecies talked about people with white faces coming across the water on logs blown by the wind, and that if they didn't leave this area, they would be wiped out. They were given instructions to travel westward to the place where the food grows on the water. And of course, that food was wild rice. So the people began a very long migration down along the St. Lawrence River, all the way down across Michigan and up around and spread out from there, and stopped because of the wild rice here and in the other areas of the Great Lakes region. So it's incredibly important to the Anishinaabeg people culturally. I was first introduced to wild rice back in 2008. I was working for Michigan Natural Features Inventory as an endangered species biologist, and I was looking for ways to work with the tribes on endangered species projects. And I was told that there was a guy that was trying to put together a traditional wild rice camp. And so I worked with him on that. And we actually held 3 of them up at his tribe and a couple more downstate in the lower peninsula here. And that time period really kicked off the I don't want to call it the modern time of wild rice harvesting here, but as you'll see as I get going on the talk, there was a big disruption in this cultural tradition and also a loss of wild rice. So this tradition has been coming back over the last about 20 years. And at the camps, what my friend Roger, that's him, the blue sweatshirt down here, what they do is they teach about how to make the tools for harvesting wild rice, how to harvest the wild rice, the cultural and spiritual teachings about it, how to process it, and it's a real community-based activity. Quite a very interesting experience, and being out on the water harvesting rice is just I don't know. It's hard to describe. It's just such a wonderful thing to do. The river rice, as I mentioned before, that grows along the river in the southern part of Michigan. Um, if you imagine trying to harvest rice, what you do is you take these about 3 foot long sticks that look like, I guess, the end of a pool cue, and you pull the rice plant over the canoe and you knock on the stick with a stick from your other hand. So it makes this clicking sound. Some people pull the rice over the boat and then brush the plant with it to knock the ripe grains into the bottom of the canoe. That's easy enough to do when you're working on lake rice, but if you're on a river and you've got plants that are 10 or 12 feet high, when you pull those plants over, all of the seeds are in the next boat over or over the lake, right? You can't get them into your boat that way. So they have different techniques that they use for river rice. This is a historic photo of a rice camp. I don't know what the year is on this one. I'm looking like maybe 30s, 40s by the vehicles. I'm not a car person, but you use a push pole, this long pole here, to push the canoe through the rice bed. These are some folks from the Nottawasapi Huron Band of Potawatomi Indians in the river rice bed. So you remember the picture of me in the canoe with Roger, how short that rice was? I mean, look at how high this stuff is. So one of the things they've been doing is they just lay some planks and walk on the shore and then try to pull over the rice grains. It's not an easy task. This is my friend Kelly and Daisy. Daisy's from the Cree Nation up in James Bay. Kelly's a member of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, and they are ricing here on a lake called Tawas Lake. This is our largest rice bed we have in Michigan. But you can see Daisy can easily pull that plant over the canoe, knock on the stick, and drop the seeds in. And this is what it looks like after you've harvested. It's pretty cool to watch this fill up, because for a while, if you look at the top of the canoe, you can see the grains are just laying there. But as it fills up, it starts to look like fur. All the awns are starting to point straight up. This was my very first harvest back in 2008. I think there was about 35 or 40 pounds of rice there. After it's processed, that would equate to about 15 pounds of processed rice. But what you do is you go out and harvest it from the rice bed out on the lake or the river. Then you have to lay it out to dry in the sun. So you spread it out on tarps and stir it with a rake or sticks or whatever. Keep turning it for 2 or 3 days so that it gets nice and dry. Then you have to parch it, and so the parching is generally done in an old wash tub, and it's tipped sideways so that it's picking up heat from a small fire that's underneath it. And you make all of your tools out of cedar wood, because that's a sacred plant for these folks. And so you take this paddle made of cedar and you just stir it around and around and around. And what you're trying to do is to dry up the hulls around the grain of rice so that you can get the hulls off of it. And the whole goal here is to get the grain of rice out of the hull. So once you've got the hulls parched, then they go into the dance pit. Now, there's several different methods of dancing on the rice, or jigging it's also called. This is one way where you drive a post into the ground and have some rails here. You wear moccasins that are specific for ricing. They're not worn at any other time. You got to keep them nice and clean. and you put rice that's been parched in a depression in the ground, and stand on it, and then you do the twist so that your feet are moving back and forth, and you're rubbing the rice with the balls of your feet, and that helps to take off the hulls. Once you get the hulls off, then you have to winnow it to blow the chaff away. And so this shows Roger. They use birch bark from the birch trees to make the winnowing baskets, as you see here. And he will drop that basket out from underneath the rice that's in it. And the air, when the rice drops back down, is what blows the chaff out. And then you check and see how close you are to getting done, but you can see the wild rice grains are starting to show up. And then the very last step is the final cleaning table. This is the best place to be at a rice camp because you basically get to hear all the stories of the elders. People come from all over to go to rice camp and do the harvesting and processing. So sometimes they only see each other once a year, but it's usually elders and children there. And they spend their time going through the rice and taking out any grains that, as we call it, still have their jacket on, still have the hull on. Those are put in a jar. And then if the kids need a timeout for some reason, they get to go pick through those one by one and take the hulls off by hand. And think about what they've done. That's what they told me. But it's a really wonderful event to go to. Here's another photo of the river rice. As you can see, it's very distinctive on the shoreline here. So when I was at that rice camp, being that I'm an endangered species biologist, I thought to myself, why have I never heard of wild rice in Michigan before? I had a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife, and I have a master's degree in ecology. You would think I would have heard of wild rice, but I had not. And the reason is because so much of it has disappeared from Michigan that most people don't even know we had it, including people who are biology folks. The tribal people, most of them know about it. There are still stories of it, but in general, it was a mystery, I would say, at that time. So I thought to myself, I think I'm going to see if I can figure out if this is a rare plant, because if I don't hear about it, nobody else knows about it, chances are it is, and it probably needs protection. So at that moment, I became a historian also. And my goal was to create a map in GIS software of all the locations of wild rice that there ever have been recorded, and all the current locations of wild rice. So I had to start doing a lot of research to try to find references to rice beds. I met with all the tribes. I talked to tribal elders and natural resources staff. I looked through databases and herbarium records, did a search of the old newspapers, all kinds of historical documents, the General Land Office survey maps. For those of you who don't know what those are, when the Europeans came here, back in the early 1800s, they sent surveyors out. The federal government did, all across the country, and created maps and broke the land up into townships, ranges, and sections. And there's a ton of information in those maps and in their notes. They were looking at the land, of course, for how could they exploit the natural resources. And so their descriptions were focused on what kind of tree cover there was, if it's good for timber harvesting or is it good for agriculture. But they included a lot of other things in there. Sometimes they would talk about the wild rice beds, they would talk about um, Indian villages or burial grounds or other things of note. Sugar bushes where the tribal folks were making maple syrup or maple sugar. So there's a lot of info in there. I looked at old historic maps, talked to historical societies, listservs, anything I could think of to find out where rice had occurred. And then I would put all that information on a map if I had specific enough locational information. And what I learned was that archaeologists had found remnants of wild rice in cache pits or food storage pits that native people who were here several thousand years ago um, had been using wild rice. And they look at what's called a phytolith, which is this really small particle of silica, and you can see the different shapes here. That those shapes are specific to the species of plant. So they found 13 sites in Michigan that had remnants of wild rice in these cache pits. Of course, the tribal folks, they know their own history, and they also know that they've been harvesting rice as a food plant for as long as they've been around here. So this map is from my book, which is 2018 is when it was published. So there has been more over time, obviously, of locations that have been discovered. But historically, if you look at the map on top there, you can see, if you look along our coastline, this is Lake Michigan here. This is Lake Huron, Lake Erie. Lake Erie's down here. This is all Lake Huron, the Saginaw Bay. You can see we had a lot of wild rice beds along the coastline. That's because we had a lot of rivers that outlet into the lakes. And if you look at the maps down here, there's like literally almost nothing as far as these coastal rice beds. These coastal rice beds were enormous. If you compare all of these sites with the historic locations and the extant sites, only 6 of the sites here show up here. So the majority of these are all gone. And this was a very depressing book to research, to be honest with you, because you place yourself back in time before the Europeans arrived here and vastly changed the landscape. Here in Michigan, they cut down all the trees from our state, literally, within a 50-year period, and changed everything drastically with draining of wetlands, etc. In my research, I was able to find credible references to rice beds that were very large. In Saginaw Bay, 10,000 acres of wild rice. The 2,000-acre wild rice bed at the mouth of the St. Mary's River. 5,000 acres at the River Raisin outlet. There was a mile-long wild rice bed at Houghton Lake here in the center. The largest bed we have now is 700 acres, and the next one down from that is just over 100. And there's just like less than a handful of those. Everything else are just small pockets. That's how much we've lost. This is an aerial picture that shows Tawas Lake, which is up here. This in Michigan we call everything's the mitten, right, for our lower peninsula. So this is in what we call the northern part of the mitten over here on Lake Huron. Tawas Lake is our largest rice bed that we have left, and at this time of year there were about 700 acres of rice, and a lot of people go here I have a reference to this rice bed from the early 1800s. So it's been a rice bed for a very, very long time. So after I started developing this map, and I still to this day add to it. It's a living document. I wanted to ask the question of why did we lose the rice? And I identified about 5 different reasons, and almost all of those impacts happened across the state. So what I did for the book is I picked out some very specific examples so I could dive a little deeper into each of those stories. So chronologically, the first cause of the decline was the logging era that happened here in the 1800s. This is one of our rivers. I believe this is the Saginaw River. And with the logging industry here back then, in those days, what they would do is they would cut down the trees and store the logs and wait for spring to come. And then when the snow melts and the water levels get higher, or they've put a water control structure to back up the water to make it go higher, they put all the logs into the river and let the river take the logs down and then out either into Lake Michigan or to the mills as they're located along the river. Remember the picture of the floating leaf stage of the wild rice I showed you. How much rice do you think could survive through surface covered with moving logs? This was absolutely devastating to the ecology of the landscape here. It also changed the water pH and water quality as well. So when we first started logging here, people went out, cut the trees down with a hatchet or a saw. They had to use horses and just drag the logs along. And it took a long time. And the best way to describe it is if you are familiar with the Amish style of farming, which is usually it's just horse-drawn plows. They use very simple methods of farming. They don't use mechanized farming. Think of how slow that process is and how restricted they are in how much land they can farm compared to an industrial-sized tractor that can plow up, hundreds of acres in a short amount of time. So in the beginning, the impact was slow on the landscape. But they started improving their technology for logging. So the first thing they did was to create these what are called big wheels. And the big wheels allowed them to pull out logs at a much faster rate with the horses. Then they started putting in railroad tracks and using the railroad to haul out the logs, which sped up the cutting and moving of logs even more. They would put these railroad tracks right through swamplands, and so they would be draining and dredging out marshlands in order to facilitate the construction of the railroad tracks. Here's an old photo that shows you some of the mills and places where they had the logs stacked on the shoreline. That was also, of course, detrimental to the water quality. So the river rice really didn't stand a chance, as well as fish and a lot of the other aquatic plants. Those of you who are familiar with, the Lorax, yes, Dr. Seuss's story, The Lorax. I always think of this as the Onceler, the big factory in that. This is a floating mill. So this mill is in the middle of a river. They take the logs right out to this mill. The mill debarks the trees, cuts it all up into boards, whatever size they're looking at, and dumps all of that debris directly into the water. This is a picture of a lake called Muskegon Lake. This is all what's called woody debris. Remember, I was just telling you about that mill dumping things into the water? This is what was dumped into the water from the mills. And this lake is on near the shore of Lake Michigan on the west side of our state. This was once a rice bed. It was completely full of wild rice. So you can see the damage that was done. Fortunately, there's a lot of work being done right now, and they are actually removing all of the woody debris, trying to do some restoration work on that. So the logging era is going on, and so they start then putting in dams at the rivers. And so the example I am using for this story is a place called Lac Vieux des Airs. This is in the western upper peninsula of Michigan. If you draw a line like right through the middle of this lake, south of that line is Wisconsin, north of the line is Michigan. This is a wild rice bed here, and the rice camp that we had that you saw pictures of was located right here. And this is where the tribal housing is for the Lac Vieux des Airs Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Those folks have lived here for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and their original place that they lived were on these islands out here. At one time, prior to the late 1800s, this lake was completely covered with wild rice. But there was a dam put in right down here to back up the water. This is the headwaters of the Wisconsin River. So this is the very beginning of the Wisconsin River. It flows like here. If you keep following the river, there's lots and lots of dams along the river for hydropower. But at this time, it was dammed up for the purpose of running logs down here. And the tribal people who lived here were obviously very dependent on the wild rice. Both, it's a major part of their diet at that time, but it was also something that they would sell or trade. And when that dam was put in, and this is a picture from the 1800s that shows you the original dam, timber dam here. When they backed up that water and removed the rice from the lake, it broke that cultural tradition in their tribe, and the people actually had to move out away from that land and into a town to try to get different kinds of jobs to sustain themselves. So it was very devastating for their people. The dam was rebuilt several times and turned into a concrete dam. But it also affected the non-tribal people who had cottages and homes around the lake. There was a huge lawsuit that happened about 15 or 20 years ago, and they had to change the water levels of that lake to bring them back to depth that would support wild rice and support the fisheries in there. And they've been trying to bring the rice back, but they're having a hard time getting it to come back, and they don't know why. It's pretty sad. So we had all of that going on into the 1800s, and then at the turn of the century, you start to get into the 1900s, and you start to get into the industrialization era. And this is actually down by Lake Erie. There's a paper company over here that's just discharging all of their gunky water right out into Lake Erie. So you can see it's just accumulating all of this toxic stuff. The area that I'm talking about here is called the Monroe Marsh, And the Monroe Marsh is near Monroe, Michigan, in southeast Michigan. It's at the mouth of the River Raisin, and it was internationally known as a hunting place to go. It had a 5,000 acre marsh here, which I mentioned to you before. This is what it looked like originally in 1820, before anything was done. You can see there's islands here. This island was occupied by the Potawatomi and by the Shawnee people. This was all wild rice in this area. And in 1835, the United States Army Corps of Engineers started going around and channelizing the rivers that outletted into the Great Lakes to facilitate shipping. So they started seriously changing the landscape here. And you can see there's a channel that was dug right through those islands I was just showing you. There's still marsh here, but as you keep going in time, you can see now it's been channelized even more. This is a really interesting map. It's a hand-drawn map from 1900. The areas that you see in red are the wild rice beds, and the rest of it is other wetland plants. The thing of note here is that I didn't mention is wild rice grows best in shallower water, anything 3 feet or less. When you start getting deeper than 3 feet, what happens is the plant has to put all its energy into growing taller and doesn't have energy to make seeds. And so it can't reproduce itself because it's an annual plant, right? It has to reseed itself every year. So when in the Great Lakes, we have cycling of high water periods and low water periods. And sometimes they're, every 30 years or every 20 years. They're pretty big cycles. So in a time period where you have high water, you don't have much wild rice at all. The beds are a lot smaller and restricted to the shallowest zones. But if you have a low water period, you can have thousands of acres of wild rice, or could. This map was drawn during a high water period. So these were just remnant populations of wild rice at that time because of the water depth. But if we keep going forward in time, 1962, now they've got a big pier. You can see the marshland is starting to shrink. And this is what it looks like today. This is showing the wild rice beds that you just saw on that hand-drawn map where they used to be. And if you want an even more depressing view, this is what was that beautiful 5,000 acre marsh today. So we had that dredging going on of the rivers that was impacting the rice beds there. At the same time, people were draining our state. Michigan is known for having a lot of swampland or wetlands. In fact, it was, and if you can often read this in the historical literature, about people saying, don't come here because it's nothing but swamps and mosquitoes. But we figured a way to conquer that. So in the mid 1800s, there was a big epidemic of malaria, and it occurred mostly in the southern half of our lower peninsula. Most everyone who got sick in those days, it was somehow related to malaria. Now, they didn't know at that time what caused malaria. They just knew that it was related to wetlands or swamplands. They had all kinds of ideas that, it came from dead animals, or it came from dead plants, or it was a celestial event. Nobody really knew. It wasn't until the 1900s, early 1900, I think maybe like 1903 or 1906, that researchers in Europe discovered that it was the mosquito that was the vector for malaria. Prior to them knowing about the mosquito, they just knew it was associated with wetlands, so they started digging ditches all over the state. And literally, the goal was to drain the entire state of all of its wetlands. And when you travel in Michigan today, you can still see these ditches. They are still draining all the wetlands. Well, they discovered the mosquito was the vector, and how the mosquito laid its eggs in the water. It could be very small puddles of water. It could be in a flower pot. It could be anywhere. So they started targeting mosquitoes. And what they would do is go around and spray gasoline or kerosene or oil on the water to suffocate the larvae of the mosquito. And as you can imagine, that also was not very good for aquatic plants or other things. So you had drainage now on top of spraying all this stuff on top of the water. So the wild rice is really struggling at this point. So while I was doing research on my book, I got a phone call from this gentleman, Frank Edwagishik. He's a very well-known tribal elder here with the little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians. He's worked on water protection for a very long time. And he called me one day and asked me if I knew about this lake over by Grand Rapids, Michigan, called Rice Lake. He said that it's now an onion farm and that his people used to harvest wild rice there. And I told him, no, I don't know anything about that, but I will begin my investigation. So this is the location of Grant, Michigan, right here, the place he was talking about. And he was referring to a lake called Rice Lake. Rice Lake was probably the largest inland wild rice bed that we had, that I've been able to determine so far. It was about 3 miles long and was covered with wild rice. And here's a picture of the map of it in 1880. These blocks here, for those of you who are not familiar, these are called sections. Remember I talked about the township, range, and section and the General Land Office survey maps? So this is a section. They're 1 square mile. So you can see how long this lake was and how wide, and it's surrounded by wetlands. This is the lake where his people were harvesting rice from. There's a lot of details about all of this story, but I'll keep it short and just suffice it to say that back in that time period, there were a lot of immigrants coming here to Michigan from Holland, and they had a tradition there and had techniques for doing what they call muck farming. And that is muck farming to grow plants like celery, onions, mint, anything that grows in like root vegetables that loves mucky soils. You only get mucky soils from wetlands, right? And you have to drain the wetlands or drain the lakes to get access to the muck. So what once was this beautiful wild area where people came and hunted and did wild rice harvesting, the local farmers decided that they wanted to convert it to a muck farm. So in 1917, they created a ditch 5 miles long and 20 feet wide, and basically drained off the lake, which I cannot comprehend how that's even possible to do, but they did. So you can see this map from 1955 with the outline of the lake, what used to be the lake. This is all now muck farms. And that town calls themselves the onion capital of Michigan. You can go out and stand in the middle of what used to be that lake and still see the forest edge of it. It hasn't changed in that way. That happened all over our state. And I'm actually working on a new book right now to document all the lakes that were drained for this muck farming industry. It's a lot of research and very difficult to find stories about this, but I'm persistent. So that's the depressing part of how we lost all of this rice. But there's an incredible amount of work being done now and has been going on for the last 10 years or so on restoring wild rice. One of the things that was interesting to me, my review of all the historical newspapers happened after I had written the book, and I was almost finished with it. And it dawned on me that maybe there was something in the newspapers back in the day about rice. And sure enough, what I learned was that the hunters were noticing a decline in the ducks. And they were blaming it on the fact that the wild rice was disappearing. I would have to say that was probably part of it. And also the fact that we didn't have hunting laws back then. And if you look at the number of ducks they would shoot in a day, sometimes it was in the thousands. That might have had a little something to do with it too. But they were putting pressure on the DNR, our Department of Natural Resources, and putting a big push out for people to start planting rice again. So even the railroads got involved. And one of the railroads that goes across our state east to west, they were throwing rice out in any area that looked like they could replant. The wildlife refuge up in our upper peninsula, they seeded about 33,500 pounds of wild rice for a 30-year period. Unfortunately, the habitat up there is not really good for it. And they weren't successful in planting it there. Whenever I do my book tour or whenever I do these talks about wild rice, people always want to know, can I plant rice? I've got a pond at my house. Will that be, can I get rice somewhere and how do I plant it? There's a lot of factors that have to be considered when you're planting wild rice. The first one is the habitat suitable? You have to have shallower water. This is a place just north of where I live called the Maple River Flooding. And you can see this is how you plant wild rice. You have these grain sacks with wild rice in it that was harvested either a week before or so. And you just grab it by the handful and toss it out into the water. It's a laborious process. But you have to have flow in the water. So this is an artificial impoundment that our Department of Natural Resources manages for ducks primarily, and a little bit for fishing, but mostly for waterfowl. You have to have a stream that flows into the body of water and a stream that flows out so that there's always a movement of water, or the rice just doesn't grow well. You have to have the appropriate depth of water, and you also have to think about whether you have a lot of animals that are living there that are going to browse it down before it ever gets a chance to establish itself. The pictures I just showed you of us seeding, you can see here that in the spring of the following year, we've got that floating leaf stage, right? We were successful. The rice sprouted. we didn't go out every year. When you plant rice, you are supposed to go out and plant for 7 years in a row so that you can build up a seed bank in the sediment. This place has a lot of muskrats. It has a lot of carp, which is a non-native species here. The carp love rice. They love the seeds of it. And in the spring, when they're doing their mating, they swirl around and churn up the water and churn up the soil, churn up the rice. It's not a very good environment for rice. So you have to think about what kind of animals that are going to be there, and if you can plant it and it'll survive it. If you're on a river, first of all, you can't get rice seeds from the protected species because it's protected legally. But if you were able to do that, you also have to have agreement with your neighbors. And even on a lake, you have to have agreement with your neighbors, because if it takes off, it can take off pretty well. And if your neighbors get mad that there's rice there, they're going to get a permit to put chemicals in the water to kill it. So there's a lot of things to think about. I usually encourage people, if they want to do restoration, to go and try to find an organization, a tribe, or a governmental agency or university who's working on a research project and volunteer your time. What we used to dream about when we first started in the old days, let me go back here a minute. When we first started working on Manoomin, we imagined that having the whole state working together, like all the state agencies, all the tribes, the federal agencies, everybody working together to protect rice. We couldn't figure out any conflict that would be arising between the tribes and the state and federal government over this particular plant. So the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative was created, and I think that's been, I don't know, time flies these days, but maybe 7 years ago or so. And it's a huge group of people. They now have a statewide stewardship plan for rice that everybody has signed on to. And we were lucky in 2024, after 6 years of lobbying, we got wild rice named as the state's native grain, which basically gives it, like you may have heard our states have state trees or state birds or state rocks, things like that. So we have a state grain here now, state wild grain, I should say. And that gives us more leverage for education and trying to get the word out about rice to make sure that it gets protected. So why is there so much fuss about wild rice other than its cultural connections and its availability and importance to wildlife and waterfowl? Well, it's really, really good to eat. And it's very versatile. One of the chapters in my book is all recipes from different tribal people around the state. But you can have wild rice just cooked plain and eat it as a side dish. You can grind it up. I have a hand grinder mill that you can grind it up and make flour with. You can make soup with it. You can have casseroles with it. You can have it for breakfast and put honey and fruit in there and nuts. I mean, you can just do everything with this. And it's very high in protein, which is really nice. A lot of people want to know, where can I get wild rice? If you buy wild rice in the grocery store, you're 99% likely to be buying paddy rice, which is an agricultural crop. They have, I think, 9 varieties of domesticated wild rice that they plant and sell. If you look at this picture here, this dark rice here, this is the paddy rice. Paddy rice is grown, it's not organic at all. It's got fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, and it's all mechanically harvested. It's an agricultural crop. The qualities that they select for when they make these varieties are to benefit the agricultural production, which is good for that. But if those traits got into the wild populations, it would be devastating. An example would be the native wild rice, true wild rice, drops its seeds at different times. It goes through like several weeks of seed ripening. So what's important about that is if a big storm comes along and knocks off some of the ripe seeds, there's still many more seeds to ripen yet, and they can continue on reseeding themselves. The agricultural varieties, they want the seeds to all drop at the same time. If that happened in the wild, it could be devastating and wipe out wild rice beds. It doesn't matter for the agricultural crop, but it does for wild beds. So there's a lot of opposition to having these domesticated wild rice beds anywhere near true wild rice. But you can always tell the difference if you're buying true wild rice that's lake harvested and grows wild by the price. It looks different when you see the grains. If you're up from Canada, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The domesticated rice is black and shiny, pretty much. The true wild rice can be black, can be gray, olive colored, cream colored, different colors of grains, different sizes. Each the rice tastes different depending on what lake it came from, also, which is pretty interesting. But the price is a big giveaway. Up in Michigan, if you're driving in our Upper Peninsula, particularly along US 2, which is the Southern Highway, there's a lot of like gift shop, touristy kind of things where they sell fudge and smoked fish and pasties and wild rice. You'll see a sign that looks hand painted and it'll say wild rice. When you think, oh, it must be local, right? Someone harvested it here. And you can get it for 3 pounds for $9.95 or something like this. Well, true wild rice, when I first started harvesting it, was we would sell it for $15 a pound. And that's finished rice. Now it's $25 a pound. And to buy it green, I used to pay $3 or $4 a pound to buy it green, like right from the lake from somebody else who riced and harvested it. Now it's $15. So the price is absolutely sky high compared to paddy rice. So that's another way to tell. So I was really interested. I got a phone call one day several years ago from the INSP channel. There was a TV show called State Plate, and they were doing an episode on Michigan, featuring iconic foods of Michigan. For those of you in the States, this gentleman here standing next to me he was a winner of the TV show The American Idol, which I don't watch, but he was a winner of that. Taylor Hicks is his name, and he's the host of this TV show. So they wanted to come and they wanted to do an episode on wild rice, and wanted me to be the featured person doing it. I told them that it had to be my tribal friends doing this, not me, because this is their culture, this is their tradition. And it was interesting. They really opposed that. They said that viewers cannot focus on more than one person at a time. And I said, well, then you'll have to find someone else to do it, because this is their thing. This is not my thing. So they finally agreed. And so I got my friend Roger, who's the one that taught me about ricing, Shiloh Maples, who's a member of the Little River Band of Chippewa and Ottawa Indians. Again, my friend Kelly from Sag Chip Tribe. they came down and filmed us in my backyard, and we went through all the different ways of processing, and it's still available. I can't remember what streaming service it's on now, but if you're interested in watching it, it's pretty interesting. The really funny part to me is the episode, or the segment before this, or the segment right after, is about celery farming in a muck farm in Kalamazoo. And I was thinking, I wonder if that was a former rice bed that they're going to be talking about. Um, but it's really interesting, and it's a good way to see the actual processing techniques in a video format. I'm not going to promote my book on here, but if you're interested in learning more, you can get them in the libraries. A lot of libraries around here have them anyway. I don't know about outside of Michigan, but there's a lot more detail about wild rice, and lots more stories and in-depth things in the book. So thanks for sticking around so I can tell you about this plant. But with that, hope everybody has a great rest of your weekend. And thanks again for joining the talk about wild rice today.